So, and I realized when I put this deck together, I didn't put the classic slide of introducing myself. So let me just do that before we start. I'm Dave McComb. I'm the president and co-founder of Semantic Arts. Semantic Arts is a consulting company that specializes 100% in semantic technology, knowledge graphs, and helping people become data centric. We've been doing that for 23 years now. So had a lot of, large clients and interesting projects and pretty good experience in this field. So that's me, and here we go. So what I hope to do mostly today is mess with your minds. We call it challenging your mental model, but everybody has an idea in their head of how the world works, and sometimes they need to be tweaked a little bit. So here's one, I'm guessing, given the audience. Oh, and by the way, feel free to ask questions as I go. If you could use your hand raising thing, that's probably the best way to do, but I don't think I can see the hands. So if somebody can watch for that, and if you want to interrupt me, happy to do that. I'll also leave time at the end for questions. So given the audience, you probably think that ontologies are complex. And certainly when you talk to non-ontologists, I'm sure you get feedback that they think they're complex. They think they're conceptually complex because, we read white papers and stuff. In fact, one of the first times I started reading a document like this, I thought it had the wrong font in it. Thinking, what is this? And this is it. They have proofs of how semantics work and all that kind of stuff. Many non-ontologists think that's complex. They think the way we write restrictions is complex, and what is all this stuff? Why don't you just do something frame-based? And then every time somebody starts to get it, and then it doesn't work the way they think, we say, oh, well, you're not considering the open world, and go on to this long explanation that usually bothers them a lot. The other side of complexity, these ontologies are often numerically complex, meaning that there are lots and lots of concepts to be learned and mastered in order to use them. And this is especially true in life sciences. I went out and started looking at numerically. I found somebody had a listing of them, but I thought, oh no, surely that looks way, way low. I mean, it looks high, and one, as you will see in a few minutes, because my theme is going to be about simplicity, but I thought that looked low, and I looked some other places. Oh yeah, there now, this is more like it. So the sum total of everything, I guess, in OBO, there's 15 million classes. So, just think about that for a few minutes of how numerically complex that is, because that's 15,000 concepts. The average college graduate has a vocabulary of 40,000 words, and you could roughly equate that most people know 40,000 concepts. There's probably, hopefully, nobody in the world that knows all those 15 million concepts. So I think there is some evidence for this belief that ontologies are complex, but they don't need to be complex. And we're going to attempt to use, or begin here today, to use the very complexity of ontologies to start making things simpler. So here, I've observed this a lot over the last several decades, and just scratching my head and watching things happen, and sitting in communities of practice and watching them crowdsource ontologies, and trying to think, where does complexity come from? Where does it get away from us? And I think it is right here. It's right when somebody says, define your terms. Because what happens is some ontologists or some modelers will go into a meeting with subject matter experts, and they start asking them questions, and they start coming up with words that the ontologists don't, well, tell me what that means. Tell me what that means. And you feel obligated to write it down, add it to the ontology, and you just keep writing and adding, and it just gets bigger and bigger. These things grow like crazy, and there's no force sort of working in the opposite direction, saying, well, what do we need to start shrinking this thing? And that's what we're going to talk a bit about today. And we're going to have some kind of case studies and things like that. But essentially, and this is an oversimplification, sorry about that. What we need to do, and this is, man, this is fresh in my mind, because just yesterday I was dealing with a client in another domain where they run projects for the federal government, and they have ACRNs, ACRNS, and CLINs, CLINS, and subclins, and they have all these acronyms, and they made up all this stuff. And at first they start designing something, there's dozens of classes, and when you finally, but you have to get through all that and work over to the other side and say, no, somewhere in there's a concept, and let's talk about that concept. Skip the words for the moment. In this case of the acronyms and the CLINs and the subclins and all this kind of stuff. I mean, the concept was that the government is asking you to do some work, and they're asking you to attach some information when you send them an invoice for the work. I mean, that's it. And then you say, what is that fundamentally and semantically? And then now, what do you want to call that? And don't call it all of those things. Maybe you can have a synonym, and that may sound not like, that may not sound terribly different than what you currently do, but I can tell you it's profoundly different. The end place that you end up is hundreds of times more simple. Here's kind of an example. This one was sort of in my mind. Once upon a time, I did some work I volunteered for the HL7, one of the HL7 groups, which is healthcare standard. And well, I'll get to it in a second. This was a subgroup about authorization. Who should be able to see what kind of medical information? And so you can imagine they had a whole list of kinds of medical information. Although that's hard enough by itself. Can the sneezer mute yourself, please? Thanks. So that's hard enough by itself just to get that list. But what they had across the top was different roles and who could see what kind of information. Let's walk through this for a quick second just to see how this works. We pretty much all agree on what a person is. And sooner or later, somebody gets sick and we say, well, that's a patient. And once somebody is a patient, we have this expectation that we're going to take vital signs and we're going to do things and we're going to administer treatments and drugs and all that kind of stuff. And those things are going to be administered by somebody we call a healthcare provider, doctor, nurse, somebody like that. And while we recognize at one level they're both people, we also recognize that contextually we're going to collect different data until the physician becomes a patient. Then all of a sudden they accrete all the vital signs and all that other stuff. But here's where it kind of starts going off the rails. Somebody discovers, oh, there are different kinds of physicians. There are internists and phlebotomists and neurologists and all kinds of, there's hundreds. In fact, what made me think of this in this HL7 exercise, the hundreds of columns were all the different medical specialties. And they had all the X's in the columns and stuff. And it's like, but actually that's not what authorization is based on. It's not based on what your specialty is. And even if it is, that it's sort of a distinction without a difference. We could just put a tag on a person and say, well, they're an internist or they're a, cardiologist or an ophthalmologist or whatever, because in almost all contexts that, calling that out as a fundamentally different concept isn't worth it. And maybe this isn't the best example, maybe a better example. We all know that there are differences between men and women, but in 99% of all companies and industries, that's a categorical difference. If you're in the insurance business and you want to charge different rates for male drivers and female drivers, you just put a tag on a person, they're male or female, they get a different rate. You don't structurally treat them different. You don't have different sets of data. So now, if you're in a OBGYN clinic, you would have different classes for males and females, and you're mostly treating females and asking different kinds of questions. Anyway, that is the beginning of a thought process that we're going to kind of develop here for a few minutes. Meanwhile, I promised 2 case studies. This is the first one. That I call this one the zero copy integration. And the reason I like this term is anybody who's been in the system integration business or data extraction business or any kind of data related business knows that what you do is you initially extract data from one system, you do something to it, you transform it, you put it in another system, whether that's API to API or application to warehouse, whatever it is. But the idea of integration or even consumption is completely tied up with the idea of copying, because in the source, it's expressed one way with one set of terms and one structure, and in the destination, another set of terms, another set of structures. And in fact, most enterprises look a lot like this. They're, well, I turned this into a data set, and then I turn another thing into another data set, and I derive one based on that, and I derive another one, and all this kind of stuff. That the idea even that you could do integration without copying things is kind of, almost an oxymoron. And yet there's this Canadian group called the Data Collaboration Alliance who is promoting exactly that. I think it's a great term of art, essentially saying, when you get this right, you will sort of know when you've got it right, when you know that you no longer need to make copies, or especially to make copies for the purpose of transforming. And one of the reasons and there's the website on the bottom of the slide there, if you're interested in more about this. We had a case study, and this was before I'd heard the term, but it so perfectly embodies the term, I thought I would share it. This is an investment bank, and when we first got in there, we got in the legal department, and the legal department has their own view on all the information of the firm, and it's an orthogonal view to IT and everybody else. They're managing the data, but legal gets to say things about e-discovery and legal matters and retention in this case, and they have to know it about everything in the firm: databases, repositories, documents, everything. So we did this project with them to extract a whole bunch of contextual information about the information of the firm. So not only what was the database and where was it and who owned it, where was the SharePoint repositories and the file folders and all that stuff, but what cost center were people charging to, who was contributing to this, what department was it in, all that kind of stuff. So in order to figure this out, we just took, in this case, we did take a copy. We took data from each of their existing sources and brought it all together into a knowledge graph where we could run some interesting analytics and figure out, what retention schedules applied to data in which of these data sets. It was a pretty fascinating project, and we did a lot more work with this particular investment bank. Years later, another group popped up who were chartered in the area of what they call technical assets to figure out things like when was data crossing a country border, and what risks do we have in Hong Kong, given the Chinese government, things like that. And so they were looking at data from a slightly different lens. And at one point they said, oh, well, we understand you've got a pipeline and you have all the data of all the employees of the firm in this knowledge graph. We would like a copy because, and then we'll change it to our needs. And these were already people building a knowledge graph. They were already savvy. And yet the mental model, we're so used to thinking, give me a copy and I'll change it. Give me a copy, I'll change it. That's what people always do. We said, no, wait, hang on. This is a graph. Every fact in this graph is just a triple. It's just a fact. This employee has this badge. This employee has this email number. This employee works for this department. There's no restructuring to be done. If you really think about it kind of deeply, that's what's interesting about a graph. In a table or in JSON, there's structure, and you constantly have to restructure things. That's why people copy and change them. The graph, you just have these assertions, and you can either say you can ignore some of them if you don't care, that's fine, and you can add to them, which may give you a little bit of structure, but really the fundamental thing is unchanged. So the original thinking, give me a subset of that, I'll change it to my needs. And they finally realized, oh yeah, I can just consume it as is. So I think this kind of embodies the whole idea of zero copy integration. And I want to put it out there just kind of as a thought starter to think, the next time you think, I'm just going to make a copy. Now, really, we made a copy from their legacy system, but I think rather than zero copy, we may start saying, this is the last copy you need to make, or the last transformation, perhaps. Let me go on to the other case study. And this is a case study more directly about the benefit of reducing complexity. And then we'll spend some time, a little bit of speculative time on the end about just exactly how you guys might do this. So Schneider Electric is a pretty large company, 180,000 employees, I think, or at the time we were there, it was. And they make about 1 million industrial electric products. And one of the most common, especially in Europe, are these modular circuit breakers. That's kind of where we started our project. And it turns out something as simple looking as this has very complex structure and criteria and stuff. There's, what does it do, and how, what kind of voltage and what kind of circuits does it work in, but also, what kind of environments can you put it in? Can this be in a very hot environment or a very cold environment or a smoke environment? All kinds of things like that. What does it work with? This is at a very high level. We're going to get a lot more detail into that. How is it shaped and packaged? And then actually at the time we did this wasn't much of an issue. And now all of a sudden it is. Everywhere you look, it's all about sustainability and the implied carbon and things like that. So there's a lot. Every one of their 1 million products has hundreds of characteristics. They're all slightly different. And in order to manage that, historically, they had a product catalog, like you might imagine. And this is a small subset of it, but it had about 700 tables and 7,000 columns. And it kept track not only of all the characteristics of the products, but what countries were they being offered in, and what were the prices and currencies and, spiffs, all that kind of stuff. So we did what we usually do. I'm going to talk about a little later in the presentation. We said, let's build a high-level enterprise ontology of the whole manufacturing business. And then we took the data about these products from this product catalog and populated a knowledge graph. It's not anything too surprising there, but after we were done, we stopped and ran a query on this and said, we're just sort of curious, what did we actually populate there? And it turns out we populated 42 classes and 36 properties. And we thought, wow, that's kind of interesting, because when you look at it, over there on the left, there's almost 8,000, 7,700 concepts that you would have to know. I mean, you have to know these things to join tables, and what do they mean, and which column should you take if you want this thing. I mean, there's a huge amount of knowledge needed to deal with the thing on the left, whereas dealing with the thing on the right is pretty straightforward. There's only that amount of complexity. Now, at one level, you may think, well, we've lost fidelity. But actually, we hadn't at all. We were working with a partner company who was rebuilding a website and everything, and all the specifications, everything from the existing, all 1 million products, all the characteristics, everything was in the knowledge graph. So there was nothing lost. But let's look at what's gained when you reduce the complexity of something almost 100 to 1. The first thing was, it used to be every time they would bring a new range of products into another country, they'd have to, they get a few hundred or a few thousand new products, and they put them in a spreadsheet, and they give them to an engineer who has to sit down and try to work out how does this product work with other products we're selling in this country, and does it conform to our local standards and all that kind of stuff. And they had these, they showed them to us. We worked with them a lot. They're very complex spreadsheets. They're all linked together. And then, of course, they have to get to a certain point where they then load it into SAP so that their ERP system can understand how things go together. So and there's a little bit of extra complexity here. So for instance, if you're the country manager of Austria, say, and you realize that the products you're about to bring in are exactly the same as what's currently being sold in Germany, but you know that you can sell for a premium in Austria, what they do, and they routinely do this, make up a new product number, a new SKU, but they know that their distributors and everyone else won't be totally fooled that isn't really the same product as the other one. So they change the spec slightly, and there are limitations on how much you can change the spec. You certainly don't want to change the voltage because people will get it wrong and destroy things. But we worked with a fair bit on what they change and what they don't change, and how do you understand that so that you're essentially arbitraging against yourself here. Anyhow, so they have all that complexity going on, and they had this idea that they wanted to automate compatibility. We thought that sounded pretty reasonable. The idea was we would take this complex process and this complex data and run it through some kind of rules engine or something, and be able to automate that. And it turned out, this at the time, the semantic web stack was just going from swirl to riff, the rule interchange format. And we thought, let's go with riff. Got the best riff implementation in the world and the practitioners and stuff. But unfortunately, they tried to recreate this process that was represented on the left and worked at it for, 6 months or so, but couldn't get it to work. And we thought we were going to get kicked out, even though we'd done a lot of pretty good work. This part of it didn't work. But then we had an idea. This is something we almost always return back to in our work, is let's go back to the real world. That spreadsheet over there isn't really the real world. That's something that somebody made up. And in the real world, we ended up saying, what is it that fundamentally makes something compatible? So we went and asked somebody who designs these things. And it turns out there's about a dozen categories of things that contribute to compatibility. And some of them are very obvious, voltage and current and things. A few of them are obvious once they tell you after the fact. For instance, a lot of these modular devices fit on a rail. So you have to, if you know the rail type, right off the bat, things that are not compatible. In most of the rest of the world outside the US, these devices snap together almost like little Lego bricks. Here we just have these switches that go on and off because our voltage is lower, but these things that snap together, there's both an electrical component and a physical component, which comes out through these pins where they poke into each other and do something physical. And if the pins are not in the same location, they're not compatible. And then one of the more subtle things, those little flipping levers, the toggles, you can gang up 2 or 3 of them, but there's certain combinations of these they've studied just by doing this in the lab. And they have these tables of which ones combined with which ones is more than the torque will handle. But turns out, once you learn this, just a few dozen things, we went back and said, we could read the data out of that database and write it back in, with Sparkle, with this insert language, and unlike most machine learning and rules stuff, which results in insights, what was kind of cool about this, we didn't think about it until after it happened. Once you learn something, you learn it as more triples. So the triples just go back in the triple store and they're now available for everyone else, and they're connected up where they need to connect up. And in this case, the new triples were that this product is intrinsically compatible with this other product, such that they then started rebuilding the website to say, as soon as we know, as soon as this product is available in this market, it's intrinsically compatible with all the other products we offer in this market, which is an incredible boon to them. It more or less eliminated that whole process and months of time to market. But then what I like to say is simplicity is this gift that keeps on giving, that new problems come up that we didn't even consider when we started the project. One of them was this thing they called Clipsol. And Clipsol was a company they acquired in Australia that made electrical products, but unlike the industrial electrical products Schneider Electric makes, these guys made residential things in the home. This is a light switch in Australia. They have these very subtle little buttons there. And they also had a catalog, and it was also pretty complex, but it was not as complex as Schneider's, but certainly not structured the same. It was completely different. All the terms are different, the structure are different, but armed with saying, I'm only looking for 42 classes and 36 properties. I just got to find, where do those things come from in this structure? So it kind of focuses your mind. You go in, you get all those things. Probably took us 4 to 6 weeks to do that. And then at the end of that, you say, okay, now we think we've got most everything out of there. Is there anything in there that's important that we forgot? And they looked around, they realized, oh yeah, there's this thing that residential people care about called aesthetic groups, which means there's certain kinds of combinations of colors that people will put together, and certainly, to designers, interior designers, ecru and bone and ivory and white and off-white, that's an important distinction. Whereas, people that build power plants, that's just white. So anyhow, we added that in. It added like 1 or 2% to the total model, and we're able to use the same queries and compatibility and everything else for this Clipsol data that we did with the rest of it. And one of the weird punchlines we didn't realize till we finished, they had acquired this company 10 years ago and hadn't integrated it because it was too hard. And, makes sense, it's too hard. And then finally they said, oh, there's this standard we want to conform to called EClass with a funny A in the middle of it. And it's all about electrical products. In fact, I recently went back to their website, and right there in the website, the first thing they show is these miniature circuit breakers. You go, yeah, that is, in a lot of ways, EClass is mostly about the kinds of products that Schneider makes. It's broader for sure, but not infinitely broader. So we sat down and said, what do we have to do to conform to that? Well, it turns out the issue with EClass is there's 45,000 classes. And we're sitting there with 42 classes. This is now, previously we were talking about 100 to 1 difference. This is 1,000 to 1 difference. And yet, because you're starting with the essence and just trying to say, where in this have you hidden, circuit breakers and their cost curves and all this kind of stuff. It was a much more tractable problem than trying to figure out how 45,000 things map to 7,000 things. So all this is kind of preamble, hopefully, for how does this report to you or relate to you. And I'm just sort of guessing, because I don't know that much about what you guys are up to these days, but I can sort of guess because we have clients in pharma and we have some ideas of what they're interested in, what they think you might be interested in. And we think, some kind of digital transformation of NDA submissions or drug approval submissions might be a pretty topical thing. Turns out, it seems like there's a whole industry out there of people explaining how you get things through the clinical pipelines and how long things take and what you have to do to speed it up. And in fact, that this industry, to call it an industry is an understatement. There's most of our clients are pretty much in agreement that if they could shrink the total end-to-end time of a clinical trial by a day, it's worth about $1 million to them. That's typically the size of the new drugs they're bringing to market, and when their patents is going to expire and all that kind of stuff. So they're hugely incented to do anything that would speed this up, including probably helping you guys. So why is converting to digital e-filing or shrinking the time for a clinical trial, why is that hard? And I think it appears to be harder than it maybe really is, partly because we've allowed the problem to stay complex. We have complex ontologies, a lot of complexity, and we feel like we need to get consensus amongst all those people out there in order to move forward. And I get why people believe both these things, but I want to put forward an idea that maybe we don't need to believe either of these things. Let me proceed here. So we have this methodology that we use pretty much in all our clients, and it pretty much always works. We call it Think Big, Start Small, but it was born from two different experiences that didn't work. One was early in the history of semantic arts. We thought that the hard thing was designing an enterprise ontology, because almost nobody had one, and it seemed to be a hard thing to do. And we thought once it was designed, people would see the value and implement it, and life would be better. But we did a bunch of them, and they just became shelfware. So we realized that wasn't it. And then in parallel, we're observing people doing proofs of concepts and agile projects and all this kind of stuff. And yet all they were doing was building new silos or experiments or something. And we finally realized in order to make progress, you have to do a little bit of both of those in parallel. You have to do enough of the enterprise core so that the first project you do fits in and is future-proofed, and you won't have to refactor it going forward. But the smart start small says, carve off something small enough that you can deal with it in a few months, but big enough that when somebody sees the end result, they will say, oh yeah, that solves a real problem, not a pretend problem in a proof of concept, but a real problem. So, that's our general methodology. It works pretty well. I'm going to project it onto you guys just a little bit so you can kind of get it into your world. Imagine you said, I want to automate or digitize filing. And the simplest possible way to start this, and maybe you guys have done this, who knows, you just take what people currently submit and say, just look at it and make a model. And anybody you can look at that, and you look at a form and make a model, but that model won't be very good. And we've done this a million times. I know it won't be very good, but it's a place to start. What happens is you first, you stare at that and you start rethinking like I was saying earlier in the presentation, what are those things really? Not what did they say on the form, and what's the description, what does it mean? It's conceptually, what are the real entities on that form? And in order to make much progress of this, you typically have to actually get real data, not a blank form. And you start attempting to bring that data in and see, does it fit my hypothesis? I believe that these things here called indications are actually diseases, but no, maybe they're not. Maybe they're presenting problems. Maybe who knows what they are, but there's a lot of hypothesizing and changing the model and then simplifying. At some point you have to really push back and say, what is the simplest possible model that expresses this information losslessly? When we get to that, you can load up a triple store with the data, with real data that you've seen historically. And the reason to do that is what we've found over and over and over again. You can build models, but until you put data in the model, you don't know whether the model's any good. The model is good when you can populate it and use it. And the second thing happens when you populate and use it, and that is you get a huge amount of confidence. In other words, if you just build a model of a form and tell people, now submit to this model instead of the form, if you haven't actually done it, and people say, oh, it's too hard, I don't want to do it, or it's not our terminology, and you kind of lose confidence. But if you've taken dozens or hundreds or even thousands of these submissions, put them in the model, and you know exactly what it takes, and you know that it can be done easily, now you could say, this is just a hypothesis, but you could say, look, we have, and I think I skipped over a bit here. There are things, just looking at that form, there are things on that form where there's, tell us what indication that this submission is for. And you go, wow, that's a big open-ended question. I would love to see what people fill into that. And we were talking to a pharma client just the other day, and I said, what's interesting about that question is 3.5 years ago, COVID-19 or SARS-CoV-2 would not have been in that list. Nobody would have applied for a drug for those because the disease didn't yet exist, or it wasn't known. My question was, I wonder where that first hits. Did it come from SNOMED? Did it come from MESH? Did it come from UMLS? Did it come, ICD-10? Where did it first hit? How did it finally get to be in an indication list? And actually, this pharma client of ours said two things that were very interesting. One, the first thing he said was it probably came from MEDRA, the World Health Organization. That makes sense. And the second thing he says, you could probably make a paper out of this. You're just figuring out how does new information wind its way through all these standards and controlled vocabularies and all this kind of stuff. But that was just preamble to really, you guys get to decide if you want to have a controlled list. Here's our list. Maybe it has some SNOMED terms. Maybe it has some, other terms from other, ICD-10 or whatever, or problem lists or whatever they are. And that's our list. If you want to submit to us, pick something from our list. If you don't like, if there's something not on our list, here's another process to request one. It's something where you don't actually need a lot of consensus. You just say, this is our list. Here it is. Here's a Sparkle endpoint. You can get the global ID for the item if you want, and then turn around and make your submission again through a Sparkle endpoint. Where the brilliance to this is, I think, if you told your customers, your pharma companies, that we have a downstream process. We go through all these steps, and we have to take data out of PDFs and put it somewhere and scrape it and whatever we do with it. If you conform to this model that we're using, that actually saves us a couple of steps. It will probably save you time. You will move ahead in the queue. And I guarantee if you tell pharma companies that this will save them a few days in their overall process, they'll just beat a path to that door. And then, what I was suggesting there was maybe just the cover sheet. If you want to start small, I don't know where you necessarily start small, but eventually it's the same process works for everything. At least so far, we've seen that it seems to work for everything. If you want the assays or the adverse results, or any sets of data, you could just gradually add them one at a time, lather, rinse, repeat. So my message, I think, is that these things that seem horribly complex and intractable, and you almost don't know where to start, they're secretly simple. And that's a really well-kept secret. But like everything that's simple, it's not necessarily easy. I think I'm going to pause here. Yep. And I wanted to leave a lot of time for questions. In fact, I'm going to put the additional resources page up here so you guys can look at it. I think that's it. Things that are related to this, if you want to pursue this further, there's, this approach that we're talking about, we call it the data-centric approach, which says that at the center of your enterprise, there's a single, simple, extensible, federatable, and directly implementable model. I realize that's a mouthful, but I say it a lot, so I know it now by heart. But the idea, every enterprise has a model at its core that has less than 1,000 concepts, often quite a bit less. And by concepts, we mean classes plus properties. That it doesn't require that you co-locate all your data. A lot of times people think if you're data centric, you have to collapse everything like a data lake. You do not. It's really, you have to have a single understanding of your information. And if you're not co-locating it, how you map to it. So dynamically at runtime, you query and bring it in. Federatable means you don't have to have it all in one place. Then you can query it across there. And directly implementable. People think that a simple model is conceptual and abstract, and it is not. We've proven this over and over again. You can directly implement these simple models. Anyway, this website, the Data-Centric Manifesto, sort of puts forward that idea. Almost 2,000 people now have signed it. They have very meaningful little notes in there. So if you're interested and if you agree, show up there. Sorry, my timing was bad. I copied this slide from somewhere else. Our virtual summit happened a couple of weeks ago, but we have an in-person thing here in Fort Collins, Colorado in June. It's mostly for practitioners who are actually trying to build architectures that support these kinds of systems. I only just recently came across this thing. I'm not involved in it at all, other than having been interviewed for it, called the Data-Centric Executive Course. And my email, if you want to get a hold of me. So if you want to, well, maybe this is being recorded. If not, if you want to take a screenshot of that, I'm going to stop sharing and take questions, I guess.